number two on my list here of questions. Can you explain to people what was agreed upon in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944? We can get to what's relevant today, but and why certain aspects of the Bretton Woods structure are on life support as we speak here. But I mean, the history, it's an aspect of U.S. foreign policy and just the structure of the entire world that I wasn't familiar with until reading about it a couple years ago. So can you give people a cliff notes of what the world used to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I want to tread carefully because I'm not an economic historian necessarily, but I do think just by and large, after World War I, you had sort of this economic chaos where you had these countries that were destroyed by the war. You had other countries that were not, and you had an attempt to sort of restart. Yeah, you attempt to restart the world's economy. Everyone's like depreciating their currency to make their competitive, and just there's a real strong sense that we don't want to make the same mistakes after World War II, and particularly amongst the U.S. I think the U.S. and this is sort of my read on this situation. I'm not sure. I'm sure I can find some historian to agree with me, but my view of history of the end stages of World War II was a lot of U.S. foreign policy was predicated on Europe. We're sick of this. we've had to bail you out twice. It's not going to happen again. And there were a lot of things that happened. I think that was the goal. That was the focus. Is we're not going to have war, particularly war in Europe, ever again. And you do, as sort of a testament, you see vestiges of this in foreign policy today, where it's just like there's an overarching, again, I don't want to say religious, but just sort of like there could never be war in Europe. There must be war in Europe. We must do whatever it takes. That sort of guides decision making. And part of this was like the EU, for example, very much an American creation. Obviously, there were Europeans that pushed for it and wanted it, but the U.S. absolutely was facilitating it and pushing for it, in part because this idea that economic union is going to make it, particularly between France and Germany, is going to ensure that they won't go to war in the future. Particularly, and it started like the European Union came later, but the European, I can't remember what it was called, with like a steel arrangement where they basically work together to produce steel. Steel's really important for war, and if France and Germany are dependent on each other to make steel, it's going to be very hard for France and Germany to go to war, right? And so that there's just this general, like, there's a lot of decisions that went into this, and Bretton Woods was absolutely part of this. And basically, the agreement was, at that time, currencies were nominally backed by almost everyone was like out of gold. Like they had, and the US had a ton of it, in part because the US made everyone, like particularly the UK, pay for all their stuff. Now, this is a whole complicated, controversial area. To what extent did the UK have to pay and the USSR did not have to pay, and what drove those decisions and things along those lines. But the net result was the US basically had all the world's gold. And you were just asking for the same sort of chaos after World War I. So the U.S. basically imposed this order, which is everyone's currencies is going to be fixed to the U.S., and the U.S. is backed by gold. And so by extension, everyone else is backed by the U.S. gold, like via the U.S. dollar. And this was, and it worked. It worked in the sense of maintaining stability. It worked in the U.S. sort of opening up their consumer market to particularly European and Japanese sort of producers. Right. So one of the who had this huge cost advantage, right? They had, because they had nothing, so they had cheap labor. They obviously had the longstanding sort of capabilities that was all destroyed in the war, but they had the ability to sort of make stuff, and it really worked. Like all the extent to which traditionally our closest allies, particularly from a military perspective, ended up being West Germany and Japan, is actually pretty amazing. Yeah. And so a lot of this stuff deserves a lot of critique. And in 2024, there's a lot of things to criticize, but it's really important to have the context of why these decisions were made, why they were, and sort of how they worked out. And so under this system, basically the U.S., this was the establishment of the U.S. dollar as reserve currency. People point to that as when Bretton Woods fell apart, But actually, no, it actually started before, because that's when all the currencies were linked to the US dollar, and the US dollar was nominally backed by gold. So when Bretton Woods fell apart in 1971, what fell apart was the linking to gold.
Right.
But it was already established that the U.S. dollar is sort of the that's the trading currency of the world. And what that enabled was you had this situation where countries made stuff, they sold it to the U.S. market. Again, the U.S. not destroyed by war, huge and growing population, very wealthy, even back then, would buy all your sort of stuff. So then these countries have all these extra dollars, and in like a normal, like classical economics thing, what would happen is the US would sort of depreciate. The currency would depreciate because you have this misbalance of this sort of account misbalance. But that wasn't allowed. Bretton Woods didn't allow the US currency to depreciate relative to these other countries. So they had all these dollars that were really valuable, and you had dollars more valuable than they should be that they converted just to US treasuries. And so the US got and so the U.S. could start running deficits. And this, you got into a state. Now, technically, the limitation on running deficits was you had to have gold to back it up. And so the U.S. gets in the 60s. We're paying for the Vietnam War. You have the huge expansion under Lyndon Johnson of like sort of the social welfare, bits, Medicaid, and all the pieces that came with that. And the problem is that this story that the US dollar is backed by gold stopped sort of being credible, because there was just so many dollars out in the world, and they're multiplying. And so basically the abandonment of Bretton Woods was abandoning the gold peg. And that triggered things like inflation, that triggered things like just the currencies could start moving against each other more. There was a depreciation that happened to an extent, but that this overall system persisted. You had established this general trading system that was mediated in dollars. You had this cycle going on, and you had this bit where to keep the whole thing working, you needed security. And the U.S. is like,
that's the key component.
Yeah, the U.S. is like, we'll take care of the security, right? I mean, this kind of ties into like the criticism of NATO. Like on a narrow objective level, yeah, it's nuts. The U.S. pays basically all of NATO, and none of these countries pay anything. You forget that the U.S. was very okay with that for a long time, because they didn't want these European countries militarizing and fighting with each other. And so there's a bit, we will pay for the security. But by the way, we're not really paying for the security.
Trade routes all over the world.
Yeah,
you're paying.
We're paying for the security with debt. The debt is the dollars that you have acquired by manufacturing stuff and selling it into our market. And so it's this sort of like circular bit. And so again, it worked.